When we talk about the final goodbye, we are really talking about the moment the narcissist realizes they can no longer convince themselves they are still in control. For months, years, or even decades, the relationship has revolved around one central force: power. That power is not always obvious. Sometimes it appears through controlling decisions or directing your actions, but more often it operates on a much deeper psychological level. It is the belief that your emotions, your attention, and even your thoughts continue to revolve around them. That belief becomes essential to the way they function. It is where they draw much of their emotional stability and sense of importance. When you truly walk away, when you stop participating in the cycle of confusion, manipulation, and emotional back and forth, the entire system they built begins to weaken. There is something important to understand about people who operate this way. Their identity is rarely supported by a secure internal foundation. Most emotionally healthy people, even after experiencing rejection or heartbreak, still have values, meaningful relationships, personal goals, and a stable sense of self that help them recover. The narcissist often lacks that inner security. Instead, their identity depends heavily on outside reflections. It is built from admiration, attention, validation, and the emotional responses of other people. Remove those reflections, and the image they carefully maintained begins falling apart. That is why a genuine final goodbye affects them so deeply. It is not simply the loss of a relationship, it threatens the identity they have spent years constructing. Without someone continuously reflecting importance back to them, the version of themselves they relied upon becomes much harder to maintain. In many ways, it feels like the collapse of the role they believed they occupied. Their fear is not simply about losing you, it is about losing the structure that allowed them to feel significant. For them, control is much more than a strategy. It functions as an emotional lifeline. The relationship was never sustained solely by love or mutual care. Instead, it often revolved around keeping you emotionally connected to their reality. Your attention, your reactions, and your continued involvement helped reinforce the image they held of themselves. When you finally step away and refuse to return to the cycle, they are left facing something they have spent years avoiding. They are left alone with themselves. That is often the most difficult reality for them to tolerate. Without the constant distraction of controlling someone else's emotions, they are confronted with the emptiness they work so hard to avoid. It is important to recognize, however, that not every goodbye creates this kind of psychological impact. Many people leave physically while remaining emotionally attached. They continue arguing, defending themselves, explaining their decisions, or responding to every message. From the narcissist's perspective, those reactions still provide emotional fuel. Even anger keeps the connection alive because it proves they can still influence you. A true goodbye is different. It removes even that final thread connecting you to the cycle. Your silence, your emotional distance, and your refusal to be pulled back into conflict become the greatest challenge to the control they once believed they possessed. It is not the words that create the impact. It is the complete absence of participation. Imagine a hunter suddenly discovering that its target has disappeared completely. It does not simply lose interest and move on without concern. Instead, the disappearance creates restlessness and urgency because the pursuit itself had become central to its purpose. In much the same way, the narcissist often depends on your continued involvement in the emotional dynamic. Once that dynamic disappears, they are left exposed in a way they never expected. The loss is about much more than the relationship itself. It is also the loss of the psychological structure that convinced them they were powerful, influential, and always in control. As that structure begins breaking down, their reactions may become dramatic. Some respond with explosive anger. Others deny reality entirely. Some seek revenge, while others suddenly become emotional, apologetic, or desperate in ways that seem completely unlike their usual behavior. Although these responses appear very different on the surface, they often originate from the same place: fear of losing control. They are not simply grieving the end of a relationship, they are struggling with the collapse of an identity they spent years protecting. Your final goodbye forces them to confront a truth they have worked very hard to avoid. The belief that they controlled everything was never as solid as they imagined. Ironically, the harder they try to hold on to power, the more obvious it becomes that it was never genuine strength. Their desperate attempts to regain influence often reveal insecurity hidden beneath an image of confidence and dominance. Once the relationship truly ends and there are no more emotional openings left to exploit, they rarely experience ordinary disappointment. Instead, it can feel as though the world they carefully organized around themselves is beginning to fall apart. That is why they resist endings with such intensity. They are not simply trying to keep a relationship alive. They are trying to preserve the version of themselves that depended on controlling it. Eventually, however, this outcome becomes impossible to avoid. No identity built entirely on external validation can remain stable forever. Sooner or later, the illusion begins to crack. When you choose to walk away permanently, one reality becomes impossible for them to escape. The power they believed they possessed existed only as long as you continued participating in the cycle. The end of the relationship, therefore, represents much more than separation. It marks the collapse of the illusion that kept both of you trapped for so long. While they are left confronting the parts of themselves they spent years avoiding, you finally gain the opportunity to reclaim your own life, your own identity, and your own peace. One of the clearest signs that this shift has occurred is the intense emotional reaction that sometimes follows your final goodbye. What often appears next is not ordinary anger, but narcissistic rage, and the two are fundamentally different. Healthy anger usually develops when someone feels hurt, disappointed, or believes they have been treated unfairly. It can be expressed, discussed, understood, and eventually released. It serves as a temporary emotional response to a specific event. Narcissistic rage operates from an entirely different place. It is not simply about feeling hurt. It is triggered when the person's carefully protected self-image is threatened. Your decision to leave permanently does more than end the relationship. It removes the illusion of control they relied on for emotional stability. Because of that, their reaction can become far more intense than the situation itself appears to justify. This is why the rage often seems disproportionate. It is not only directed at your decision to walk away, it is directed at what your decision represents. Your refusal to return forces them to face the possibility that they no longer control the story, and for someone whose identity has been built around maintaining that control, there are few experiences more unsettling than realizing someone has truly moved beyond their influence. Narcissistic rage often appears without warning. It can feel sudden, intense, and completely overwhelming because it comes from a place much deeper than ordinary anger. It is the response of someone whose fragile sense of identity has been shaken at its core. What makes this reaction so powerful is that your decision to leave is not interpreted as a simple rejection. To the narcissist, it often feels like betrayal. And from their perspective, betrayal is almost impossible to tolerate because it challenges the image they have spent years protecting. They convinced themselves they were indispensable, that they held a permanent place at the center of your emotional world. They believed your life would always revolve around them in one way or another. The moment you walk away and remain gone, that belief begins to collapse. Instead of accepting the truth, they frequently respond with anger because anger feels safer than facing the reality that they were never as untouchable as they imagined. This reaction becomes easier to understand when you recognize that many narcissists never developed healthy ways of processing painful emotions. Early in life, they often learn to defend themselves against feelings of shame, rejection, abandonment, or worthlessness by creating an exaggerated identity built around confidence, superiority, and importance. That carefully crafted image became a shield protecting them from the emotions they could not bear to face. Your final goodbye breaks through that shield. Suddenly, the painful insecurities they spent years hiding begin pushing to the surface. Rage becomes the defense that allows them to avoid confronting those wounds directly. Their anger serves an important psychological purpose. It helps them escape the painful realization that they no longer control the situation and that the powerful identity they projected depended far more on illusion than reality. Rather than questioning themselves, they direct all of that emotional intensity outward. That rage can take many different forms. Sometimes it appears as shouting, insults, accusations, threats, or explosive confrontations. Other times it becomes much quieter and more calculated. They may respond with prolonged silence, attempts to damage your reputation, gossip, manipulation, or efforts to turn mutual friends and family against you. In some situations, they shift into the role of the victim, insisting they were the one who suffered while hiding the anger beneath a carefully crafted story designed to attract sympathy. Although these behaviors look very different on the surface, they all grow from the same emotional source. They cannot tolerate the fact that you are no longer supporting the version of reality they created about themselves. One of the most confusing aspects of narcissistic rage is how completely out of proportion it often seems. Someone observing from the outside may struggle to understand why the end of a relationship could produce such an extreme reaction. But what they are witnessing is not simply heartbreak. They are watching the collapse of an identity that depended on constant admiration, attention, and emotional validation. To the narcissist, your departure represents much more than someone choosing to leave. It represents the destruction of the world they believed they controlled. If you have experienced this yourself, you know how deeply disorienting it can become. Their intensity can leave you questioning your own judgment. You may begin wondering whether you truly are selfish, uncaring, or responsible for everything they accuse you of. That confusion is not accidental. It becomes part of the cycle they are trying to pull you back into. Their anger is not only an emotional reaction, it also functions as a strategy. By overwhelming you with guilt, blame, or emotional pressure, they hope you will begin defending yourself, explaining your choices, or arguing your perspective. The moment you do, they regain the emotional engagement they have been seeking. This is why standing firm during narcissistic rage is both one of the hardest and most important things you can do. Their anger is rarely about who you actually are. It is about what your independence forces them to face. Your decision to move forward shines a light on the emptiness they have worked so hard to hide. Instead of confronting that emptiness themselves, they attempt to place it on you through criticism, blame, and emotional attacks because blaming someone else feels much easier than facing their own unresolved pain. As you begin recognizing this pattern, something important changes inside you. You stop viewing their behavior as a measure of your worth and begin seeing it as evidence of their own internal struggle. That shift allows you to step outside the emotional game that kept you trapped for so long. In many ways, narcissistic rage becomes an unexpected confession. It exposes the vulnerability they have spent years trying to conceal. Beneath the confidence, arrogance, and constant need to appear superior often lies a profound fear of becoming insignificant. They fear abandonment. They fear being forgotten. Most of all, they fear being left alone with themselves, without another person constantly reflecting back the image they desperately want to believe. Ironically, the harder they try to appear powerful, the more visible those insecurities become. Their rage often reveals exactly what they are trying to hide. The mask begins slipping at the very moment they fight hardest to keep it in place. That is why the final goodbye carries such lasting significance. When you remain steady despite their anger, refuse to defend yourself endlessly, and decline every invitation to restart the cycle, you accomplish something much greater than ending a relationship. You confront the very fear they have spent their lives avoiding. At the same time, you reclaim something they never wanted you to fully recognize within yourself: your independence, your resilience, and your ability to build a life that no longer depends on their approval or emotional influence. Always remember this truth: their rage is not proof of strength. It is often a sign of desperation. The more clearly you understand that distinction, the less power their manipulation holds over you. What once seemed intimidating begins revealing itself as the final attempt of a collapsing illusion to preserve itself. Narcissistic rage is often the sound of that illusion breaking apart, and every time you choose not to argue, not to justify yourself, and not to step back into the familiar cycle, you quietly demonstrate that whatever control they once believed they had no longer exists. After the final goodbye has been spoken and the initial wave of rage either explodes or slowly fades, many narcissists move into a very different phase. Their approach often becomes more strategic, more subtle, and far less obvious than the emotional outbursts that came before. Instead of openly fighting for control, they begin looking for quieter, calculated ways to regain influence, often disguising those efforts beneath behaviors that seem harmless on the surface, but are carefully designed to draw you back into their emotional orbit. Sometimes these attempts are subtle. Other times they are manipulative, carefully disguised beneath words that sound emotional, sincere, or heartfelt. On the surface, they may seem genuine, but underneath, the objective remains the same: to pull you back into their emotional world. One of the most important things to understand is that narcissists often do not view relationships as equal partnerships built on trust, respect, and mutual care. Instead, they tend to see them as systems of influence where their sense of importance is continually reinforced by your attention, emotional investment, and willingness to engage. The moment you walk away, that source of validation disappears. Psychologically, this creates what is commonly referred to as a narcissistic injury, a deep blow to the image they hold of themselves. Once that injury occurs, their mind immediately begins searching for ways to repair it. That is why so many people are surprised when the narcissist refuses to simply disappear after the relationship ends. Instead, they often return with new approaches designed to reopen communication. One of the most recognized tactics is called hoovering, a name borrowed from the idea of a vacuum pulling something back in. The purpose is exactly that: to draw you back into the dynamic by whatever method seems most effective. Sometimes hoovering appears through unexpected kindness. The narcissist suddenly becomes warm, attentive, affectionate, and resembles the version of themselves you fell in love with at the beginning. Other times they rely on guilt, reminding you of shared memories, past promises, sacrifices, or emotional moments in an effort to awaken your compassion. They may present themselves as heartbroken, lost, misunderstood, or in desperate need of support. If those approaches fail, they may switch strategies entirely, using pressure, intimidation, emotional threats, or accusations intended to make you feel responsible for their suffering. Although the delivery changes, the objective never does. They want access to you again. At the center of all these behaviors is one deeply rooted belief. Control must be restored, and you are the person they believe can restore it. Ironically, these moments reveal something they work very hard to hide. If their confidence were truly stable, manipulation would not be necessary. Genuine emotional strength does not depend on guilt, deception, persuasion, or emotional pressure to survive. What becomes visible instead is dependence disguised as confidence. The more desperately they try to regain your attention, the clearer it becomes that they depended on your emotional energy far more than they ever admitted. Psychologically, these behaviors expose the fragile foundation beneath the image they carefully built. Their attempts to pull you back are usually not evidence of sudden self-awareness or meaningful personal growth. More often, they are reactions to the discomfort created by your absence. Without your attention reflecting value back toward them, they are forced to face an emptiness they have spent years trying to avoid. Re-establishing contact allows them to temporarily escape that uncomfortable reality. This is why compassionate people need to be especially careful during this stage. Empathy is a beautiful quality, but when it exists without healthy boundaries, it can easily become an opening for manipulation. A narcissist may suddenly appear vulnerable, remorseful, or emotionally softer than ever before. Those changes can awaken your natural desire to help, understand, or forgive. But compassion alone is not enough. It must be balanced with wisdom. Without that balance, empathy can quietly lead you back into the same painful cycle you fought so hard to escape. The question you should always ask yourself is simple. Are these behaviors the result of genuine transformation, or are they another attempt to regain influence? In many situations, time provides the answer. Real change is rarely dramatic or immediate. It develops slowly through consistent accountability, honest self-reflection, personal responsibility, and sustained effort. Those are precisely the qualities narcissistic patterns often resist. What initially looks like transformation frequently turns out to be desperation, a temporary response aimed at repairing the emotional injury caused by your departure. There is another layer that deserves attention. When the narcissist tries to draw you back in, they are often attempting to rewrite the ending itself. A true goodbye creates closure, and closure carries enormous psychological power. It marks completion. It communicates that the chapter has ended and that no further influence remains. For someone who depends on keeping emotional control alive, closure feels threatening because it removes the possibility of continuing the cycle. If they succeed in pulling you back into even one conversation, one argument, or one emotional exchange, they gain an opportunity to blur that ending. Suddenly, the separation no longer feels complete. The story appears unfinished, and they can convince themselves that influence still exists. This is why silence often becomes one of the strongest responses available. Not endless explanations, not repeated negotiations, not trying to prove your point one final time. Instead, consistent distance and emotional steadiness. Every explanation you offer creates material that can be reinterpreted, challenged, or used to reopen old dynamics. Every emotional reaction gives the cycle another opportunity to continue. Silence, by contrast, removes the emotional fuel entirely. It is important to understand that this kind of silence is not weakness or avoidance. It is a deliberate decision not to participate in a pattern that no longer serves you. Sometimes the strongest form of control is choosing not to engage at all, so when those attempts to pull you back begin, recognize what is truly happening beneath the surface. The issue is rarely love, understanding, or reconciliation. More often, it is an attempt to avoid accountability, avoid emotional emptiness, and avoid confronting parts of themselves they have worked very hard to keep hidden. Every time you step back into the cycle, you provide another escape from that reality. Every time you remain firm, you leave them with fewer places to hide. Eventually, when kindness no longer works, guilt loses its influence, and intimidation fails to produce results, many narcissists move into another familiar phase, the smear campaign. At this point, their attention shifts away from trying to reconnect with you and toward controlling how other people view the situation. This happens because accepting the identity of being the person who was left behind feels deeply threatening to them. From their perspective, abandonment is not simply painful, it is humiliating. And shame is an emotion they often struggle to process internally. Rather than facing it, they frequently redirect it outward. To protect their self-image, they begin creating a different version of the story. In this rewritten narrative, they become the misunderstood victim, while you are cast as the source of every problem. They may describe you as unstable, selfish, overly emotional, ungrateful, manipulative, or even abusive. These accusations are not always motivated solely by revenge. They also serve another purpose. By projecting their own uncomfortable feelings onto you, they temporarily preserve the identity they are desperately trying to protect. The smear campaign is therefore about much more than damaging your reputation. It is another attempt to restore the emotional balance they believe was taken from them. If they can convince enough people to accept their version of events, they momentarily regain the sense of control that disappeared when you chose to walk away. But no matter how convincing the story may sound, it cannot change one simple truth. The reason they continue rewriting the ending is because they were never prepared to accept it in the first place.